Good morning. Welcome to everybody joining us on today's webinar. This is being run to support the RTPI's Northwest Regions programme of training events. My name is Mitch Cook and I'll be the chair this morning. I'm going to run through a few housekeeping rules before we start the main presentation. The session will be an hour and it is being recorded. We will have the panel presentations for around 45 minutes. And then we'll have around 15 minutes for questions and follow-up. These questions can be posted via the chat function throughout the presentation, and we'll be asked the panel at the end of the presentation as a whole. So if you do have a question, and I would invite everybody to think about challenging questions for the panelists, please can you put that into the chat function and who you want to direct the question to. It will help keep the answers focused. And so the presentations this morning will be from Matt Ellis on understanding climate risk. Amy Kennedy will then follow Matt on how we should be planning for climate resilience. And I will then use a few project examples to show how this is being done in reality. Let's see if we can get the presentation to work. Okay, I'm a bit of a technical issue here. I will see to show my screen. Okay, so I'm hoping everybody can see my screen now. Yeah, not from Amy. Great, fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction to the RTPI and their work on climate change. You can clearly read this, but the RTPI's work on climate risk is guided by the concept of climate justice, and they consider that communities will be impacted differently by climate change. And therefore, to be successful, responses must carefully consider their different needs and voices. And through their work on climate change, the RTPI are pushing for UK planning systems that support the rollout smart energy grids, helping cities to develop strategic climate resilience policy and support the UN's campaign for the Sustainable Development Goals, amongst other projects. And so I'm just going to introduce the panel. As I've said before, my name is Mitch Cook. I am the director at Greengage Sustainability, Greengage Environmental, I should know that. I'm an ecologist by training. I have been involved in corporate sustainability for about 20 years. My team provide a range of services to the built environment. We work on a corporate level, providing organisations with direction on how they can address their impacts on climate change and biodiversity. We work for local authorities and helping them set out what their climate change and net zero pathways should be and what programs they need to do, and that includes capacity building. We also work on a project by project basis, so at a very granular level, and I'll show some of those examples later in the presentation. I'm going to introduce Matt. Matt Ellis is the Greater Manchester Climate Resilience Lead. He is a very eminent expert with over 20 years experience as a qualified planner in the public sector. Matt has often come across situations where taking a nature-based approach to environmental issues as a way of addressing a rapidly changing climate underpins generally sustainable economic growth. His early involvement in major developments adjacent to the River Thames include the Millennium site, now the O2 Arena, and that showed him how blue and green infrastructure underpins successful developments. His wider work on the growth agenda, first in the southeast and then in the northwest, reinforced his belief that critical ecosystem services and natural environment systems provides need protecting and planning for, just as we would do for any piece of crucial infrastructure. And now, with the climate emergency more front and centre than ever, Matt is convinced that we will capture the value and climate resilience services following from our natural environment and use this to both protect and massively increase investment into it. He has this has all led to Matt's involvement in the development and now delivery of Greater Manchester's innovative nature-based nature-based financing, the Ignition project. This is testing and developing the necessary funding and delivery mechanisms to deliver a significant uplift in urban green infrastructure and the vital climate resilience services these will provide. And so introducing Amy Kennedy. Amy is a partner at Deloitte. Deloitte Real Estate. She is involved in the planning system and bringing forward developments that integrate climate resilience and mitigation, and has been involved in a range of urban developments. Her career highlight is Mayfield, where she is still involved in delivering the new scheme and major part of infrastructure for Manchester city centre. Thank you. So I'm now going to talk about and provide an introduction to climate change. I think it's widely accepted that climate change is obviously happening and that it is a result of man's interventions or the activities by man on it. But the question is, why bother? And why bother particularly with respect to the built environment? Now, the built environment emissions make up for about 60% of the emissions in the UK. It's a very large component of the overall footprint of the UK. And it's clear that at last organisations and councils and interested parties are setting out net zero pathways. But the challenge is not necessarily in setting out and adhering to those policies and pathways, which will in itself be difficult, but living with climate change until those pathways become effective. Climate change has a certain amount of inertia in its system, and even if we were to turn off all the emissions today, climate change would continue to increase and the impacts associated would continue to be seen for many years to come. And so we have to learn to live and adapt to climate change in the current situation. And that involves, therefore, looking at our communities and looking at our developments and places that we live, work and play, and building in resilience. That may be at a council level. It may be looking at how councils integrate their net zero pathways. But more importantly, it might be around how we as an organisation, how we as a country use this opportunity on the back of the pandemic to build back better and greener. So that's my introduction. I'm now going to ask Matt to go through his presentation, and I will change and allow Matt to present. In the meantime, you will see me muted, and I will turn off my webinar, my camera as well.
Can I check if everyone can see my script or see the presentation?
I can, Matt.
Okay, good. Thanks very much, Mitch, for the introduction. I would say that I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding climate risk in the built environment. I'm not a climate scientist. I've just been knocking about the climate resilience agenda for some time. And my major contribution to the Ignition project, which you won't get from the slides, is that I came up with the acronym, which is fundamentally important for a European funded project. What I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and probably those of you who are local authority planners or more generally interested in this agenda will understand that many, if not most, of the local authorities have declared a climate emergency. It's a global crisis, but it has local consequences. What does this mean? What does this look like? And this change and the risk that comes with it, the climate change, we need to look locally and understand how it might impact the built environment and its users. So I'll cover that slightly, but not in major detail. And because I think it follows on in the other presentations and the case study examples at the end, I'm going to start to sort of set the scene about what could and should built environment professionals do about this. And I think that will be fleshed out by some of the examples we see later. Global heating, we know that it's driving local changes and increasing risks, but if you consider it globally, you start to get graphics like this, which show, you know, quite worrying increased temperature trend, but not actually what that's driving in terms of local impacts. Even if we start thinking about this at a member state level, a nation state, we can start seeing all of these extremes coming through and increasing in intensity and frequency. This is sort of temperature anomalies, essentially heat wave or overheating events. But again, what does that mean for particular places and spaces within these nation states? We start to see, you know, global mapping. 2019, last year, it doesn't seem like it seems ages away, was the second hottest year on record, just over a degree above average, pre-industrial average, and actually getting perilously close to the 1.5 degrees that we've committed in the Paris Agreement to kind of try and keep temperatures below. But what does that actually mean for the UK and the Northwest? And this is some of the issues and problems that we have when planning for climate change and understanding and planning for its impacts on the built environment. And you have to understand that hazards themselves, the increased temperature that's driving more extreme weather, is only part of the risk equation. You need to be exposed to that extreme weather. So, you know, my work in Greater Manchester, if we start to see sea level rise problems, we're really in trouble. But Warrington, where I live, actually with things like storm surge and sea level rise and the Mersey, that might become more prevalent. And it depends on how vulnerable the asset or the population that's exposed to that risk is. So we know that elderly people or health impacted people are more vulnerable to flooding or do worse in high heat events. So all of these three things come together and give you your climate risk, and you have to understand that and then understand how you might react to that. And this is where it becomes quite complicated and quite often easy to put it in the too difficult to do box. And there are other factors that drive risk. So I quite like this. I mean, everyone will be aware of how areas urbanise over time. This is Greater Manchester over a century or so. But the way we seal over our urban areas exacerbates surface water flood risk. We see it in even suburban and the residential areas through things like urban creep, sealing over of driveways, decking, connecting everything to the combined system. And also, these densely urbanised areas perform worse in high heat events. So the concrete and things absorb a lot of heat, and actually some of the airflow and cooling is less effective than in rural areas or on the kind of urban rural fringe. So actually the way our places are designed and perform fundamentally exacerbates or improves the climate risk we experience. But to really understand how this works and what this means for very local places where we're starting to make development management and other decisions, or even at a local authority level, we need finer definition. And we are starting to see that. We are starting through some of our research partners in Greater Manchester. This is a few years old now, to see, you know, evidence of distinct climate zones. The early UK CP09 climate projections were 25 kilometre grid squares, which, when you zoomed out to a UK level, was, you know, interesting pictures and maps, but not actually any use locally. You start to be able to understand the likely changes at different time horizons. So if we zoom in a little bit here, the Mersey Basin zone, which is this one, probably 50% of Greater Manchester. In 2050, high emission scenario, I'm sorry, it's not ever going to be lower than that. 50th percentile probability, as likely as not, 3 degrees warmer on the warmest day in summer compared to the baseline, 11% wetter on the wettest day in winter. But again, when you think about the scale of that zone, that southern zone, you know, it's really hard to make any planning decisions based on that. So what you need is locally specific climate change data, spatial data particularly, and this is emerging, but not everywhere. So this will be maps that are familiar to most, if not all of you as planners and built environment professionals. This is the EA's flood zone 2 and 3 maps. The Irwell you see flowing here into the Salford and Manchester city centre, dark blue being flood zone 3, 1 in 100-year flood extent. And as part of the GM spatial framework, they refreshed the strategic flood risk assessment, and they commissioned JBA to remodel the flood zones using the Environment Agency's projections of scarily 70% increase in fluvial flow by the end of the century. And if you kind of look at the two, the light blue hashed is the 70% increased flow. And broadly speaking, what we're seeing is in many of the Greater Manchester rivers that over the rest of the century, flood zone 2 becomes flood zone 3. So we already know how we would treat development in flood zone 3, what is appropriate, what's highly vulnerable, how we might need to think about flood risk assessments, protection. And we actually will know as development comes forward in these other areas, 60 to 100-year life, the sorts of things we might start to need to think about. Are they appropriate at all? Do we need to think about how they might need to adapt over their lifetime? Will we need to build in flood resistance and resilience? Could we manage localized flood defences? So it is starting, but as I'll start to sort of conclude now, there are technical elements to this. We need data and interpretation, and actually, you know, if we're all planners or built environment professionals, spatial mapping and visualization locally is incredibly important. But do consultancies, local authorities, local planning departments actually have these skills and capacities in-house? How might we build them in? So I've talked about, you know, Greater Manchester using a commission with JBA. We have many research partners. Some of the latest Met Office climate projection data is 2.2 square kilometre grid squares. You do need someone to help you put it into GIS, but actually this is where we need to go. But we also, and as Mitch introduced, you know, I'm an advocate for taking a nature-based approach. We know that blue and green infrastructure stores water, absorbs water, cools things down. It has a climate resilience benefit. And actually it's often driven by other planning considerations, biodiversity net gain, health and well-being, access to green space standards. So putting this stuff in and designing it correctly and responding to a number of planning drivers can increase resilience. And I'll finish off with a few bits of evidence coming from the Ignition project, which is really starting to understand the value flowing from these nature-based solutions and how they benefit. So Ignition is an innovative funding project, so I'm not going to go into that, but basically it's been trying to build business cases and financing mechanisms for sustainable drainage, for green roofs, green walls, etc. And in doing that, it's been looking at a lot of evidence, 1,000 or so pieces of research, and it's starting to understand that street trees, for instance, if they're in commercial districts, 30 to 50% increase in restaurant patronage. Research is showing that. You remember I said about the Mersey Basin zone seeing a 3-degree increase in the warmest summer day in 2050? Well, actually, street trees, it's not quite as simple as that, but they can reduce temperatures by about 3 degrees. They sequester carbon. We start to understand how much they cost to install, so we can build a business case. Green roofs, vegetation, actually quite significant building energy savings, so starts to contribute to the net zero part of the climate emergency. If they're accessible, quantifiably, they uplift the property's value. They have an acoustic benefit. Quite interestingly, green walls give you some of the energy saving and temperature reduction, but in certain circumstances, street canyons, not all pollutants, but they work really well if designed correctly about removing NOx. And we think about our low emission zones coming forward, charges to that, so you can start to understand the health and well-being benefits maybe green walls can feature. And I did mention in one of my previous slides, and I'll finish with this one. This is a little graphic by AFL Architects. You know, maybe not to this extent, because not all of these roofs will be suitable, but actually these sort of interventions do make places and spaces look fantastic. They fundamentally increase their resilience, they deliver against biodiversity targets, they improve people's health and well-being, and they sequester carbon in some instances. So, you know, I'll leave you with that thought before I hand back to Mitch.
Thank you, Matt. Very interesting. And I particularly like that graphic of the greening of Manchester. I think it's very powerful to see the opportunity there. Thank you very much. I'm now going to ask Amy to pick up on the next set of slides. Amy, I'm just giving you the opportunity to present. Hopefully you've picked that up.
Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Perfect.
Great. Thanks very much, Mitch. Just to clarify, I'm a planner at Deloitte, not a partner, although I appreciate the promotion. And many thanks to Matt for a really interesting overview there of the risks posed to the built environment by climate change and the data behind these risks and how solutions are coming forward. In this section of today's event, I'm going to focus on how planners can address climate risk through our work in creating better, more resilient places. We're going to look at the effects of climate change and the drivers, some headlines on climate risk in the built environment, some discussion on how we can plan for climate resilience, and then a quick look at the framework for that within the legislation and guidance context in England. And then finally, we're just going to sum up with a climate resilience planning toolkit. So the effects of climate change. I think following on from some of the data Matt was sharing with us about what's happening in Greater Manchester, if we zoom out to the bigger picture globally, the Met Office image, which is shown on the left of the screen, sets out some of the drivers, impacts, and indeed the damage which is being wreaked on the planet as a result of human activity and the climate change coming from that. I think the image sums up really how all of these things are actually quite interconnected. And, you know, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has understandably dominated the news agenda since February this year. But just prior to this, some of the worst effects of climate change were being played out across the globe, both at home and abroad. I think we've got an image here of the Australian wildfires in late 2019. And then below that, I think we can all probably remember the damage caused throughout the UK from storms Kira and Dennis in February, which resulted in record flooding. So I think to invoke an activist mantra, climate change is real and we can see it happening all around us. So just to look quickly at what's causing climate change, I think we all know this, but the primary cause is greenhouse gas emissions, which are gases that absorb and emit radiant energy within the thermal infrared range and cause the planet to heat up. Primary gases involved here are water vapour, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide and ozone. This slide shows the contribution made by various economic sectors to global greenhouse gas emissions. It's not surprising that energy production for electricity and heat is the single largest contributor, followed by agriculture and other land uses. In terms of the built environment, buildings contribute around 6% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. But as the next slide will show, this isn't the full picture of the degree to which human activity relating to the construction and occupation of buildings is having a negative impact on the climate. Of all the greenhouse gases, I think it's recognised that carbon dioxide emissions have the most damaging long-term effects on the climate. This is mainly because once carbon dioxide is emitted to the atmosphere, it hangs around for a long time. So that's between 300 and 1,000 years. So as we are changing the atmosphere by emitting carbon dioxide, those changes actually endure beyond the timescale of many, many human lives. Scientists know that the increases in carbon dioxide are primarily caused by human activities because of carbon fingerprints, basically, which result from burning fossil fuels. So although human activities relating to construction and buildings may account for only 6% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, this slide shows that this sector's contribution to all carbon dioxide emissions is a huge 40%. And the slide shows, you know, how that's apportioned throughout the whole building life cycle and its uses. So this is clearly a cause for concern for all of us who are engaged in planning, designing and delivering new development within the wider community of built environment practitioners. Another significant driver of climate change and very interlinked is biodiversity loss and habitat degradation. These are very interlinked because while climate change has severe direct and indirect impacts on biodiversity and is a dominant driver of future biodiversity loss, at the same time, the loss of biodiversity magnifies the adverse effects of climate change. There are several other drivers of biodiversity loss, including habitat degradation and destruction, the introduction of invasive alien species to ecosystems, and these threats are just magnified by climate change and become part of the same problem essentially. Land use and habitat protection does lie at the heart of this, but as planners and built environment practitioners, we're not only concerned with buildings, but the space around them. So I think it's clear that any vision for climate resilient places has to encompass our physical environment in its entirety. So that's bricks and mortar and all the green or blue spaces in between, which are of equal importance. I think apart from any moral imperative to act as built environment practitioners to reduce the risks of climate change on the planet, there are also, as we can see here, very real material and financial risks arising from the impacts of worsening climate change. They're set out on this slide, and they range from very real material risks around structural integrity and associated insurance and finance difficulties to much wider societal risks around human health and well-being. So how do we reduce these risks and create built environments which are more resilient to the shocks of climate change? The answer to that really is to plan for climate resilience by taking a two-pronged approach, which involves firstly mitigation, which is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and trying to stabilise the levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then secondly, adaptation, which is about adapting to the climate change which is already in the pipeline. I think it can be summed up really by considering it as an approach which includes mitigation and adaptation will hopefully result in climate resilience. So what does climate resilience look like and how can we plan for it, and what are the issues we need to consider? So this slide captures some of the headline ways in which we can plan for climate resilient places through a range of adaptation and mitigation measures, which I'm sure everybody is pretty familiar with. I think it's worth noting that this image dates from 2012, and having said that, the measures it suggests remain pretty much standard today in 2020. I think some things we might add now in terms of climate resilience considerations are things like the circular economy, how we handle waste, alongside new economic activities like the rise of data centres, online shopping and associated logistics and distribution hubs. Sustainable food production also remains a considerable challenge, especially when viewed through the prism of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. So I think we are all aware of the broad range of physical interventions and solutions which are available to us as built environment practitioners. And I had a quick kind of like round with my team, sort of brainstorm some of these ideas which we can think of as being solutions that, you know, we see in our work and in the projects that we do. And if you look at this slide, I've set them out so that they're broadly aligned along the adaptation approaches and then the mitigation approaches, and there's you know, some overlap in the middle there between the two. I'm sure there are a number of other solutions which colleagues who are here today can think about. And I think this just sums up really that there isn't a magic bullet necessarily in terms of cheap instant fixes to mitigating and adapting to climate change. We do know what the solutions are, and many of these solutions can actually be introduced into development proposals with relative ease. And this is provided enough time is allowed for the design stage and that sustainability considerations are taken on board from the start. And that includes factoring in an M&E into building design rather than trying to retrofit things. I think it's also worth noting that firmly in the middle, providing both adaptation and mitigation benefits, are what we might call nature-based solutions, green and blue infrastructure. Whereas if we look at the mitigation part of the slide, these are predominantly more kind of tech-based solutions, such as microgeneration, modular construction, which propose mainly mitigation benefits. And And I think, having said that, it's also worth noting that the reduction in the UK's overall carbon emissions at the moment is being driven mainly by the decarbonisation of the national grid. So I think within this context and the ongoing economic uncertainty engendered by the pandemic, it's likely, I think, in the short to medium term at least, that we'll see an increasing focus on nature-based solutions to climate change as one of the primary means of creating climate resilient places. So, having considered some of the solutions, I thought it might be helpful to just quickly look at the current planning policy context for delivering this. To the left of the slide, we can see what the current policy and legislation framework is. We've got the MPPF, and sitting beneath that, of course, we've got the PPG, other material considerations like the National Design Guide. There's a pretty comprehensive kind of number of sections within these documents which address the issues of climate change and climate resilience. And then as well, sitting alongside that, we've got existing acts of parliament. So that's obviously all the Town and Country Planning Acts, but also the Climate Change Act 2008, got various statutory instruments. Of course, we've got the EIA regulations, and then local and neighbourhood plans. Sitting to the right of the slide, I think there are a number of things we need to consider as being drivers for change in terms of the direction of policy, legislation and guidance for planning for climate change. The overarching direction of travel in this is set out in the government's 25-year environment plan. And the backdrop is, of course, the UK's withdrawal from the European Union and the raft of legislation which is currently making its way through Parliament, which will replace much of the regulatory system for planning, including the EIA regs. And then also in the mix, we've got the Planning White Paper, which was recently published and looks how to radically reshape the planning system in England. Indeed, it proposes streamlining the system and moving towards a more map-based spatial framework for planning. And then bubbling under here, we've got a number of technical documents which are currently being drafted. So that's the National Model Design Code, Framework of Green Infrastructure Standards, and also the England Tree Strategy. Just to touch very quickly on what the government's objectives are in terms of the 25-year environment plan. This slide shows that there are 10 goals which are underpinned by 6 policy areas. This is the cornerstone of the policy basis for the Environment Bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament, and can also be seen within some of the proposals contained within the Planning White Paper. So considering the drivers for change and what the implications might be, and also I think viewing it through the prism of nature-based solutions, I think there is an idea that we can get to the way forward within the planning framework, looking at both the Environment Bill and the Planning White Paper, and elements which are set out in those documents, which if they were combined, might provide a tangible way forward for the delivery of climate resilient places. I think I have focused here for the sake of brevity on nature-based solutions, but in thinking about this, I can see how it could equally be applied to the delivery of district heat and power networks and local level renewable energy, or transport and low traffic zones, because it's a very kind of spatial approach. So if we look at the Planning White Paper, some of the proposals within that talk about identifying areas for growth, renewal and protection as 3 broad categories for land use and planning. There's discussion of a move towards map-based local plans. There are a number of sections on how to plan for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and it also discusses a simpler framework for assessing environmental impacts and enhancement opportunities. With the Environment Bill, that sets out that the UK will be covered by a wide nature recovery network. This will be supported through the production of local nature recovery strategies. And of course, sitting alongside that, we're going to have mandatory biodiversity net gain being introduced for development. So I think in considering these items, you can start to imagine how a new strategic spatial planning framework for climate resilience might be delivered through the planning system. It could be done something like this, perhaps. So the MPPF could set out a requirement for local nature recovery strategies to be incorporated into the local plan. These local nature recovery strategies could identify and map local nature recovery networks. A local plan could be underpinned by both these principles and the mapping that goes with it. And in producing that local nature recovery network mapping, you can see that there could be a spatial structure within which areas for growth, renewal and protection could be identified and could sit within the local plan. So almost like a skeleton within which protected areas can sit, or like veins of life flowing around new development areas. This local nature recovery network mapping could also show areas of opportunity improvement, and that would enable better green infrastructure integration and biodiversity net gain delivery through new development. So I think just to finish quickly on this, this is a screenshot which is taken from the mapping platform that Matt shared earlier. It's the Mapping GM platform, and I think the upcoming work on the production of a local nature recovery strategy for Greater Manchester will be a really interesting possible roadmap for the future. So the GMCA was chosen as one of DEFRA's 10 pilot authorities for this work, and the GMCA is the only combined authority who are going to do this work at city region scale within the pilot. So I think there's a lot of thinking in the green infrastructure community at the moment about how landscape scale needs can be married with local level needs, particularly in balancing biodiversity gain and habitat creation for restoration, and getting that balance between human needs for leisure and pleasure, and then also the needs that we have to restore biodiversity and create better, greener places. So the pilot, I think, is a golden opportunity really to build on some of the amazing work that the GMCA have already been doing, especially the mapping team who have all this amazing data which is just waiting to be used really, in setting a way forward for delivering green infrastructure through spatial planning. So I think to wrap up, it's a very fast moving picture in terms of the policy basis for planning for climate change and resilience. And as ever, the devil will be in the detail. I think particularly around what's likely to come forward to replace the current EIA regime. But in the meantime, before I hand back to Mitch, I just wanted to highlight that the RTPI recently launched an interactive toolkit for planners who want to understand how to reduce carbon emissions while also managing climate impacts such as flooding and overheating. So this is the index of climate tools. The RTPI have produced this with CAD consultants, and it takes the form of an interactive online directory showcasing 18 climate mitigation and adaptation tools, which can be used in development management and plan making. That's available via the RTPI Learn platform. And while you're looking at the RTPI's pages, it's also worth checking out Plan the World We Need, which is obviously the campaign that was launched recently by the Institute to put these issues at the top of the agenda and how we recover from the pandemic as well. Thank you very much for your time today. I'm going to hand back to Mitch now.
Thank you, Amy, very useful. Sorry, I didn't mean to promote you so early in your career, but thanks for clarifying that. Very useful in terms of understanding the planning drivers. What I'm going to do now is try to share some examples of where we have seen or been involved in the delivery of some of those green infrastructure and nature-based solution projects. So I'm now going to talk about how we are building in resilience into developments, and I said it'd be based on some practical examples, both those that have been delivered but also those that have been planned. I'm going to show you this screen, and many of you would have seen this already, one like this, or this screen in particular. It is London. I tried to find one for Greater Manchester, but wasn't able to. But essentially, this shows those areas within an urban context that are hotter, those are redder and show the golden colours, and those that are cooler, those associated with green infrastructure. And it's quite clear that those areas that have a higher degree of canopy cover, a higher degree of vegetation, are cooler and provide a function for cooling of a city in the context of the kind of the urban environment. But this one, if you take that down to a more street level basis, shows the difference you will get in thermal temperatures or air temperatures associated with vegetation. So in this instance, a set of trees and part of the landscaping. But also, if you look at that in the wider context and other green infrastructure, you will see the same differences. And the differences are quite stark in air temperature. But these things, in terms of the application of that knowledge, aren't new. We have seen for many, many years local communities know the value of vegetation, and particularly trees. And they not only protect those communities from overheating, but also provide the opportunity for communities to come together, and they use that space for community meetings. And so therefore, green infrastructure, the greenery and the vegetation associated with developments, can not only deliver resilience in things like changing climatic conditions around air temperature, but also can provide opportunities for people to come together in placemaking. And they can help new and old communities come together. And that not only addresses the issues associated with climate resilience, it also provides opportunities for community benefit in terms of addressing isolation or loneliness, particularly those issues are seen in an ever urbanizing environment. But it also provides the opportunity for biodiversity, as Amy was saying, to be integrated into the greening of cities. And so I'm just going to show some slides now where that's been evident, and some practical examples. So people may have recognized this slide. This is the grey to green initiatives that were integrated into Sheffield city centre as a result of the impacts from flooding a number of years ago. And you can see that not only do they provide a great opportunity in terms of managing surface water and flood risk, but the species diversity provide great habitat for biodiversity, and integrating biodiversity into the urban form is something I think we may all appreciate in the last few months or so with the pandemic. Access to green space and functional green space, and green space that has a variety in the way it looks, but also the way it has different structures, is known to provide benefits from a mental health well-being point of view. But clearly, it also provides opportunity for people to enjoy that space and bring people together in that space, as well as providing flood attenuation and biodiversity benefits. You may already see this. This is one of Amy's projects. This is the Mayfield Regeneration scheme in Manchester. What's central to that scheme is the need to address the flooding risk, flooding issues associated with the river that runs through it. But it is also something that has been seen as an asset, and it's 6.5 acres of Mayfield's Park that has been designed to provide a range of different spaces that address the need not only to provide kind of floodable meadows and biodiversity ecological areas, but also quieter spaces for escape and contemplation. Again, this is a site and development that has integrated green infrastructure and looked at the multi-beneficial elements that it can deliver. And one of the interesting parts, I think, or slides that Matt showed, was the financial benefit associated with good design and how that can increase things like footfall or retail value, or in some instances an increased value in terms of the residential properties as well. Another example of how this has been integrated is the Northern Gateway project. Many of you will know that. What's central to that is the River Irwell, and how that is being integrated as a green corridor to connect communities, but also how the urban form will integrate green infrastructure into the way it functions. And this, to me, is a really good illustration of how that concept is being applied in placemaking. You know, it's very green. You can see there's the integration of green space and public meeting spaces and outdoor eateries is a key element to that. So not only does it provide a resilience in the regeneration of the Northern Gateway area, it provides an opportunity for a community to come together in that resilient space. And the narrative in Northern Gateway is about place making, but clearly in that narrative there is a set of objectives and a vision to deliver green infrastructure as a central part of that generation. A bit closer to home, on one of the schemes I've worked in, this is the Elephant and Castle scheme in South London. It's a scheme that aims to deliver 3,000 new homes. It's the first UK climate positive development, and when it's complete in a couple of years' time, in 2025, it will deliver a range of different green infrastructure initiatives, both at roof level, but also as part of the Central Park and green landscaping as well. So we're involved in monitoring the performance of those green roofs, both in terms of biodiversity, but also in terms of water attenuation, flood attenuation. There's a huge amount of green space here. It has been a central part to the overall development. It has been a change in terms of what there was before. The old Haygate estate did have a range of very mature trees that have been retained, but the actual estate itself was very lacking in terms of connected green space. And this Central Park has been designed, as well as the avenues around it, to provide opportunities for people to come in from outside the development. And as part of that approach, the developer, Lendlease in this instance, curates a range of activities in that park to promote activity and therefore kind of social cohesion, social coming together. The area is well known as being having a number of social issues, one of which is about mental health and well-being, and that green space has been designed specifically to address some of those local issues, which is a point which I think I'll come to in the next slide. This is Clapham Park. It's a scheme that we helped with for Metropolitan Housing Trust. It's an area of South London, an existing housing stock that's been transferred over to the trust itself. We were involved in setting out the wider sustainability objectives, not only how the buildings performed in a climate resilience approach, but also the spaces between the buildings and how you can get a well-performing development that delivers on high density and provides new homes for the community, but also how you can get a landscape that functions not only to address things like flooding, but also to integrate elements of local food production, or again, spaces that are curated to provide activities, and how those activities can open up opportunities for kind of intergenerational mixing. So not only are you looking at a kind of climate resilience component here, you're looking at a community resilience. And as Matt was saying in his presentation, there are a range of benefits associated with green infrastructure, placemaking, and that social value side of things was very clear in the objectives that the council wanted, but also the client was able to deliver in this scheme, which is now being built out. Again, apologies for the London-centric slide in here, but this is quite an interesting scheme. It's Meridian Water. It's the largest regeneration scheme that London Borough of Enfield are delivering at the moment. They have provided the opportunity to deliver a new station, but what is central to their sustainability strategy here is the access for other parts of Enfield that currently can't get to that wonderful Lee Valley Park, and the opportunities for them to be more active, both in terms of a physical activity, but also in terms of a mental health and well-being activity. If anybody knows this area, it's quite divided. There is the North Circular and quite a major roadway that splits the site. And part of the placemaking strategy was to provide opportunities not only for local employment in the development of kind of a local nursery and the delivery of green infrastructure and the management of that green infrastructure. So providing opportunities for local people to upskill and provide those new skills for the future. And that was also part of the approach for the development and the modular systems and modern methods of construction. But also, what not untypically for urban environments, the local populations weren't very active, and as a result, there were a number of poor health outcomes that would result, resulting. So high levels of diabetes, high levels of childhood obesity. And through design and through good design using green infrastructure, it's been brought forward for a to connect those populations that have those social and health issues to a resource that can help address some of those issues in the local population. And this is a scheme that I've worked on more recently. It's for the Catford Town Centre master plan. It is for the greening of that town centre, principally to provide placemaking, but what's clear and very obvious was that this also needed to be climate resilient. It's adjacent to a major watercourse that floods, and in traditional ways of dealing with that, it was very heavily engineered. But this scheme aims to provide opportunities for the people that live, work and play in Catford to reconnect with those green spaces and be more active. And this framework and the approach taken for that climate resilience and delivering a social value placemaking is something that we're seeing elsewhere. And so I just wanted to provide that practical illustration of some of the examples of projects that we see, but also those that we've been involved in. And essentially that's the end of the presentations. We've got now about 10 minutes for questions. I'm just going through some questions there, and perhaps people can put a few more. I have a couple of questions myself for Matt and Amy, so perhaps Matt and Amy, you can join and I can field a couple towards you. So Matt, one of the things that we are finding, and I don't know whether you are finding it too, is that levels of understanding in terms of green infrastructure and nature-based solutions vary across not only the UK and different city regions, but also between different stakeholders and interested parties. Can you give us an insight as to whether you think that carbon literacy is as good as it should be and how we might address that? You on mute, I think, Matt.
Okay.
Okay.
We were saying by the organizer. Yeah, so I think in terms of the kind of climate literacy, if you like, I think a lot of people know the benefits of green infrastructure and the need to promote more of it. I mean, it struck me that in your examples, and when I put up that kind of slightly ambitious skyscape of Greater Manchester kind of greening over, actually some of the Elephant and Castle particularly, it looked a bit like that. And I think that what we're seeing here, and obviously things like urban heat island effect and some of that is more prevalent in the southeast, but there does seem to be a bit of a divide. You know, I'm sure other than the Sheffield Sud Streets example, I don't think we were getting many examples that weren't flood driven. Whereas in the south, what we were getting was a much more kind of broader green infrastructure application for managing more diffuse climate risks like overheating, surface water flooding, surface water management. So I sort of see there's a real difference in terms of I don't think there's a climate or carbon literacy issue. I think it's about where the market and the development industry and the clients are willing to try this stuff or specify it. Mm-hmm. So the Enfield, or I don't think it was Enfield, the major social landlord transforming that estate. Would that happen in a northern housing association? So I think and this is where I think Amy mentioned about the kind of build back better, or maybe it was you, Mitch, that I think that's where we need to capitalise, because if we are starting to transform or understand how we might spend and regenerate places, we've got some great examples elsewhere. We just need to increase the application.
Absolutely. I mean, that kind of leads me on to the question I had for Amy, which is we see the drivers, but actually, are we seeing the clients drive it from their own perspective? And Matt, your slide showing the commercial value or the financial value of having green roofs or urban greening in terms of increased footfall is quite well known. the benefits associated with energy use and energy savings is probably people are less aware of. But Amy, are you seeing clients be open to kind of urban greening, green infrastructure, nature-based solutions approach?
I'll switch my mic on. I would say definitely yes. I think the issue remains viability in the cases of new development and what developers' contributions are expected. So I think also there's the issue that I alluded to in terms of bringing issues like M&E online for consideration much earlier on in the design process. I think developers are very open to delivering really good new green infrastructure. It's expected on larger schemes that they'll be accompanied by fairly substantial landscaping proposals where space obviously allows. But it's making sure that that's factored in to the design process as a consideration from the start, rather than just being done quite near the end, where actually, is it just about visibility and aesthetics, or are we actually looking at this in a full kind of ecosystems approach in terms of the building, its occupants, the spaces around it? So I think I do think clients are very positive about it, but it needs to be kind of considered a lot sooner sometimes.
So just following on from that, then how would we encourage that to be considered more earlier on in the design process?
I think that's a good question. I think it's not enough to say, well, if we put it all into the planning policy and guidance, then it will flow. Because actually, what I've realised is, a lot of local authorities do already have really, really good local planning policies around climate change, resilience and adaptation, mitigation and green infrastructure. But what we've seen, I think, over the past 10 or 12 years, really since the financial crash in 2008, is viability being squeezed. Local authorities have different priorities. So, of course, housing remains a huge priority for many, many local authorities. And when you consider it all into the mix, some local plan policies are inevitably given higher prominence than others. And it's about really the pre-application process, and I think really understanding what the local planning authority want to see new development deliver in the main. It would be absolutely wonderful to think that we could have everything through development, so plenty of affordable housing, plenty of new green and blue infrastructure. But that's just not the case in terms of obtaining finance and making a scheme stack up so it's actually deliverable. So to me, the key is not so much let's invent loads of new planning policies. I think the planning policy is there in many cases, but it's in that pre-application stage where perhaps there needs to be a better understanding of what the council wants.
Okay, great. And I'd agree with that. I think that getting that clear direction early on does provide the opportunity for that lateral thinking. Actually, our experience has been that the design team and the main team really get into kind of nitty-gritty of designing places that have those features and understand the benefits those deliver, but they need to get involved early so that it's integrated into that process. Matt, I had a question about the Ignition project and whether that's being replicated in other areas, and how do you share findings and information with other stakeholders around the project?
I mean, there's a lot of activity now. The project's kind of fully underway around sharing. There's a lot of sort of similar projects looking at building business cases. I noticed in the chat a few comments coming in saying, this is nothing new. We've understood these things for years. And I think going back to what Amy's saying, we weren't, and this is the whole premise of Ignition, it's not proposing any new nature-based solutions. It's not proposing kind of, algae trees that capture air quality. What it's proposing is we need to find better ways to deliver and scale and transfer the things we know already work, things we know process, the policies say we should do and do allow us to do, but somehow it falls out. sharing the successes is really important. And one of the things I've noticed, you know, in terms of working in and around Greater Manchester, is some of these places where it doesn't fall out, there's a local authority, commercial partner, and other landowner consortium going on, and it is allowing, you know, through, you know, input of value through the provision of land, supporting. So it's allowing a much more positive conversation about how all of the benefits flow and what you want to achieve in the end product. And I know that's the case for Mayfield, and it feels like it's the case for Northern Gateway. And I think, you know, there's a business case that's underpinning that. And I think that's the thing we should try and share more, because we're not talking about new, exciting, you know, state-of-the-art technologies here. What we're talking about is really good placemaking, good green space, and delivering it and seeing it through and then getting the benefit.
No, I'd agree with that. I think actually sometimes as an industry we try to over-engineer or overthink issues, and actually we should be going back to something. I think it was covered in the chat. You know, let's go back to some basic elements, and let's remind ourselves of how nature would deal with these things, and that's of course why it's called nature-based solution. So I think that's a good point to round up. I think we're mostly at the end of our presentation and discussion. I'd like to say thank you very much to Matt for your very interesting presentation. I think it's really good to know that Ignition is starting to gain momentum, and we're sharing those ideas and those findings. And Amy, thanks very much for outlining how we think that's being delivered and the drivers through the planning system on providing and ensuring that good placemaking integrates with green infrastructure, that integrates with biodiversity, that integrates with climate resilience, that integrates with social value. I think actually, you know, there are multiple benefits to be delivered, and we do need to ensure that our communities are resilient, and they are resilient from a climate perspective as well as a social and community resilience. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody, and also people for joining us today. This presentation, the presentations will be available, and as I said before, this webinar is being recorded. Okay, thank you very much, and we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.